Good morning and welcome to the second day of the COMO UK 2021 conference. My name is Matthew Clark. I lead the new mobility team at Steer, and I'm also the chair of COMO UK. I've been involved in the world of shared mobility for more than 10 years, and I'm delighted to see the growth and diversification of the industry, from car clubs to bike sharing, and more recently things like shared e-scooters and digital demand responsive transport. Today, our session is entitled Strategies in Action, Cities and Regions Pushing Shared Transport Forward. We've got a great range of speakers that bring experience from large UK cities and European cities. They cover all the modes of shared mobility I've mentioned and have experience of the challenges and successes of shared mobility. So I'm going to take the opportunity to invite each of the speakers to introduce themselves and talk a little bit more about shared mobility in their cities and regions. Then I'll have some questions as chair, and we have a poll for some audience participation. Finally, we'll take some questions from the audience. And as we're working through and people are talking, please share your questions in the question and answer bar on the right-hand side of the screen as we're talking. So I'd like to introduce each of our panelists in turn, and I'm going to ask them to talk for 5 minutes, introduce themselves and talk about the topic, strategies in action, cities and regions pushing shared transport forward. So first on today is Nicola Kane, who is Head of Strategic Planning, Insight and Innovation for Transport for Greater Manchester. Good morning, Nicola.
Good morning, Matthew.
Good to see you here today, and it's over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, that's great. And it's fantastic to be here this morning. We've been doing a lot of thinking about shared mobility in the teams that I'm responsible for at Greater Manchester, and we're really excited by the opportunities that we think shared mobility can bring to support more sustainable lifestyles. So I suppose just for a bit of context, part of my role is to help develop long-term transport strategies for Greater Manchester, and our 2040 transport strategy, which we refreshed at the beginning of the year, has what we call a right mix vision, which is effectively a set of mode share targets. And we're targeting at least 50% of all trips in Greater Manchester to be made by sustainable modes by 2040. And a lot of the focus over recent years has been on improving our public transport network, our Metrolink system. We're doing a lot of work on buses at the moment, and also on active travel. But I think increasingly we're seeing the opportunities that shared transport can bring to fill some of the gaps in the traditional public transport network, and to give people a range of alternative choices to help them lead less car-dependent lifestyles. So I very much see shared transport as being part of that wider B network vision, which Andy Burnham, our mayor, has talked a lot about, which is about providing the right integrated London-style sustainable transport network that enables people to live fulfilling lives without needing to own a car. So the team has been doing lots of work looking at a range of different shared transport services. We're currently working on a shared mobility strategy, which we're hoping to publish next year, which is looking both at the sorts of shared services which we think might be appropriate in different locations in Greater Manchester, and also the sorts of infrastructure that we'll need to support that. And we're developing proposals for a range of mobility hubs in different locations across Greater Manchester. And just over the last month or so, we've seen a lot of really exciting developments on our streets. We've had 2 e-scooter trials running since earlier this year in some pretty big trials actually in Salford, and more recently in Rochdale, which I'm particularly excited to see because it's not necessarily a sort of location that you would generally see as a natural focus for shared mobility. So we're monitoring those closely to understand the potential benefits and the risks around e-scooters and how they can provide another alternative for people to get around different parts of the conurbation. We're also now in the process of rolling out our cycle hire scheme, and by next summer we'll have 1,500 bikes on the streets of Manchester, Salford and Trafford. 300 of those will be e-bikes. So again, that will help to give us a really good understanding of the role that shared bikes can provide in giving people an alternative to the car. And we've also got a 1-year pilot project called eHubs, which has just started to go live over the last couple of weeks, which will give people in Manchester and parts of Bury access to electric car club vehicles and also to e-cargo bikes. And the e-cargo bikes have been a really interesting one because obviously completely new mode of transport, certainly in Greater Manchester. And we've seen some really positive responses from families and for people using them to move goods around local areas in Manchester. So that's really exciting. And we're doing a lot of work around, as I said, around mobility hubs, and particularly looking at the role of mobility hubs around some of our Metrolink stops and rail stations. So I'm excited about the future of shared transport. There's lots more to come from Greater Manchester in terms of setting out clearer set of plans over the coming months. So watch this space, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation this morning. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Great to hear all the exciting work you're doing. I'm particularly keen to try the new cycle hire scheme next time I'm in Manchester. I've been watching that one closely, so great to have an update there. So thanks, Nicola. We'll invite you back for questions in a minute. Next up from our panel is Johnny Munro, who is Public Policy Manager UK and Ireland for Bolt. Good morning, Johnny.
Morning. It's good to see you again, Matthew. Thanks very much for having me. I think I became involved in COMA. I think it was last year. I had a meeting with Richard in January last year, which is when I just joined Bolt. So this is actually my first conference I've spoken at, and it's been really interesting to look at some of the discussions over the last day or so. So yeah, thanks very much for having me. Just to introduce a bit about Bolt for those of you that don't know us. So we are the largest European mobility platform. So we operate in over 45 countries now with around 75 million passengers. And that's across all of our verticals of products. So we have electric bikes, scooters, car clubs, and we're moving into food and grocery delivery as well. In the UK, just operating ride hailing. So we're in 16 cities, which has grown from just being one, which was London in January. So that's been a really interesting growth. So I think my reflections on shared transport in the UK are fairly new. We obviously only have ride hailing at the moment. We're very, very strong in Europe. We've been rolling out the ride hailing proposition. But with each of those launches, we've been discussing with local authorities shared mobility options that Bolt has that we would like to do and trial in those different areas. So I think my focus for this session really is two themes really. I think the first is how do cities and regions use shared transport to limit this private car-led recovery? I actually think, and I'd be interested to get panelists' views, I think we're in danger of sort of squandering the active transport and multimodality gains that happened during the pandemic. Last year you couldn't actually buy a bike because of the demand. I'm sure we'll hear more about shared schemes like the Santander scheme in London, but they were booming. But I think we are in danger of returning to that legacy of private car use unless we could do something to increase more, to improve the environment for shared mobility options. Roads in London, particularly the southeast, are now busier than they were before the pandemic. And car use, I think, is actually only one of the few transport modes that's actually fully recovered, whatever that means. And then the second thing I would say is how do we use multimodal transport to feed into greater use of shared transport? So it's interesting. Yesterday I was speaking to Patrick McLaughlin, the former Transport Secretary, and he said one of the first things he did when he became Transport Secretary was have the new intake of fast streamers present to him about their vision for transport over the next 20 years. And he said that all of them said that their transport would be smartphone-led, booking, payment, ticketing, and all of them said that this would cover all modes of transport, which they could just seamlessly swap around. So they sound like a very, very switched on group. I'd like to see where they ended up. And I think that's a really, really interesting reflection from that group, that a lot of this would be smartphone led, A lot of it would be using the modes of transport seamlessly, so they could swap between apps or have it on the same app. So I think looking at it through a multimodal lens, if we assume that people are only going to move from private car use to shared transport if it's convenient for them, then these modes of transport need to be connected and integrated and easy for them to use. And that's really what we're trying to build at Bolt, is a super app where people can use different forms of shared transport on the same app. So we talk a lot about unbundling the car at Bolt. So if, for example, 40 to 50% of trips are done by private transport, 54% is public transport, 4% of the ride hailing. How do we break apart that 42% into shared transport? And I think it really can only be done with a partnership between private operators like ourselves, who have the scale, and also integrating them into public transport networks to help boost that. So one of the most interesting things we're doing at Bolt at the moment is looking at multimodality, and whether we want to be an active multimodal platform or passive. So passive just means that we have the options on the app and that's it. But active multimodality means that we can actually use data, the location of different shared mobility vehicles to nudge people across. So we're testing, for example, if someone requests a journey of less than 4 or 5 kilometers for a ride hailing trip, we will suggest to them that they use a scooter if there's one within 300 meters of them. So I think, what we're doing at Bolt is looking at how we can use our big scale, 75 million passengers, to nudge people into different modes of transport that are perhaps more suited to their journey. And that's what I'm really, really excited about, working with cities and regions in the UK to try and test this hypothesis about whether it can be done.
Thanks very much, Johnny. Great to hear about how you're thinking about bringing some of your wider experience across Europe to the UK, and look forward to having some Q&A with you in a little while. Thanks, Johnny. So next up, we have Alex Pazichanix, who is Head of Policy from Vianova. Welcome, Alex. Yeah, the floor is yours. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, and it's a pleasure to join you guys. My name is Alex Pazichanix. I'm the Head of Policy and Partnerships at Vianova. Vianova is a French-based mobility startup. We began about 2 years ago and are now working in approximately 40 cities around the world, primarily Europe, but also the Middle East and Australia. We are in the UK working with a number of county councils, including Oxfordshire and Northamptonshire, and primarily focus on the relationship between operators, actually between the two partners who most recently spoke, right? Cities, authorities, government regulators on the one hand, and operators and mobility service providers on the other. We think that there are communication barriers sometimes in between these, and that data is quite valuable to both. And so we serve as a platform for sort of interpreting and analyzing that data in a way that actually changes and improves outcomes. My personal background, I'm actually a former city planner in the US, in Pittsburgh and Seattle, focused on kind of new shared emerging mobility topics that didn't fit cleanly in one department or another. And so I'm quite excited to be talking about this topic because I think that there's a huge opportunity at the moment, as was mentioned by a previous speaker, a risk, but also a chance to still capitalize on the gains from the post-COVID period, and how to fundamentally restructure and change people's behavior, recognizing that no single shared mode is going to replace owning an automobile. It's a silver buckshot approach rather than a silver bullet to decarbonization, but there's still, I think, tremendous opportunity to shift. Because we are working globally, we gain perspective about the value and the use of shared mobility in a range of different markets. We managed about 9 million trips last month, data points for vehicle types of all sorts, bike share, car share, scooter share, moped share. And it's quite interesting to see the various types of efficiencies that are gained in different markets globally. I'm quite impressed by the utilization of shared mobility in the Nordics and Scandinavia, particularly given the hostile on occasion climate. But we've seen vehicle rotation trips per device per day in many markets close to 3, which in the shared mobility space is quite good. And I think this is testament to the role of infrastructure and good design in shared mobility success, right? There's a linkage between shared mobility and good land use, and shared mobility and good cycle paths, parking infrastructure, mobility hubs. This infrastructure piece ultimately, I think, really drives the demand and the use of these shared mobility modes. And so as cities are thinking about how to accelerate shared mobility, infrastructure obviously plays a huge role in it. I think we're also quite impressed by cities that have found ways to successfully integrate both spatially and digitally, integrating different shared mobility modes together. Milan comes to mind, and the role of both bike share, car share, scooter share, and moped share all operating in concert with one another, and a standard evaluation of kind of the success metrics of these modes in a single place, rather than kind of treating them as diffuse items. And then finally, a city that I'm watching, and one that is near and dear to my heart, as a project that I began while working for the city, is some of the work happening in Pittsburgh right now, and their sort of Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, focused on this concept of universal basic mobility, and the way in which, when appropriately coordinated, a suite of shared mobility services can adequately replace private vehicle usage, particularly for persons on low incomes. And I think this is a really exciting pilot that'll be getting underway in 2022, with partnerships on the scooter front, as well as car share, cycle share, and public transport. I think this is a really exciting pilot that can ultimately provide some valuable lessons to the UK and the rest of Europe as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. Very interesting and great to have your insight from both your role at ViaNova and also your previous experience working for cities in the US. Thank you. Okay, next up we have Matthew Penchars, who is Head of Public Policy for UK, Ireland and Benelux for VOI. Matthew, welcome to the COMO conference. Good to have you here. It's over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Matthew. And good morning, everybody. As Matthew said, the other Matthew said, I am Head of Policy for VOI in the UK. For those of you who don't know, VOI is the largest micro-mobility operator in Europe, with the most number of vehicles or e-scooters on the streets. And here in the UK, we have about 50% market share of the e-scooter trials, and we also operate some e-bikes. When it comes to what cities should be doing around the transition to a net zero future, I was at COP 26 last month, and although obviously in large part quite uplifting, I think it is worth noting that there was still far too much focus perhaps on essentially swapping out all the internal combustion ICE engines, powered vehicles, cars, vans, or whatever, to battery electric vehicles or hydrogen transport, and not enough around modal shift. So we have seen congestion increasing in cities, and the numbers of private cars increasing in the UK over the last few decades. And some of the figures are quite astonishing on the numbers of vehicles on our streets and how that congestion has really increased. And just swapping out 3 tons of depreciating metal that only moves 5% of the time, if you're a particularly active motorist, does not seem to me to be the most efficient use. You think about all the embedded carbon and the waste that needs to be dealt with. If you think around, is it sensible use of all those resources for 3 tons of Tesla to drive around about 70 kilos of me, rather than 35 kilos, for example, which is the weight of a VOI shared e-scooter, or for that matter, my bicycle, which obviously weighs a great deal less. When you think about the government's own targets, they say if we carry on with business as usual, congestion is going to increase, further increase by about 40% over the next few decades. And with INRIX's report yesterday showing that London is allegedly the most congested city in the world, it might suggest that is not a path we want to go down. And in fairness to the government, it has set targets of 50% active travel for urban journeys by 2030. And when you think about the proportions of journeys that are made in cars are extremely short. So at least the London statistics are a third of those are under 2 kilometres, and then another third are between 2 and 5 kilometres. Now, not all of those can be walked and cycled. Clearly, that is the case. People are encumbered, they're perhaps carrying heavy stuff, they have their children, they're disabled, whatever it might be. But I think we all need to realise that many of them can be done through active transport. And similarly, not everybody wants to get on a push bike. Some people want to get on an electric bike or on an e-scooter. And I suppose there is a real hierarchy there of active travel modes and shared transport modes. And we really need to give people lots of options if we're going to nudge them out of their privately owned depreciating box of metal sitting outside their house. So car clubs, shared cycles, shared e-bikes, and shared e-scooters. And all these different modes of transport are the carrots that we as operators and city authorities, as people need to encourage these different modes into their cities and regions, need to bring along. But they do go along with some nudges, with some sticks, I suppose. So things like low traffic neighbourhoods, things like in due course, and I think it's almost inevitable when you think about what will happen as we electrify the car fleet in the UK, some form of road user charging, because as the carbon tax on fuel whittles away, as people switch to electric vehicles, clearly the government is losing billions and billions in revenue, and that really is a burning platform. But bringing in these changes, such as low traffic neighbourhoods, such as road user charging, congestion zones or low emission zones, these are not easy, and it takes political bravery. It takes bravery from officers as well, and there is disquiet. But in my roles before coming to Voi, I worked at London City Hall under Boris Johnson, when he, for example, brought in the Boris bikes, Santander cycles. And I remembered some of the fierce opposition there was to that as they came in. Some people didn't want the docking stations outside their flats or their shops. You fast forward, was it 10, 11 years since that scheme went in, and you don't hear that anymore. And similarly, when you hear about the arguments, and they can be very visceral, over low traffic neighbourhoods, I think back around the TfL-funded Mini Holland scheme in the London Borough of Waltham Forest in northeast London, which was an extremely difficult time for the political leaders of that borough as they drove that forward. Again, you fast forward 5-6 years, and you see it's extremely popular, and you see spending per head, for example, higher on the high streets in that area than they had been before. People who walk, cycle, e-scoot, e-bike to the high street tend to spend more money than people who park on the 20-minute free parking spot and rush in and run out of that shop. But bringing in these new forms of transport isn't easy, as I'm sure all the operators in the conference have expressed. It is quite difficult, and it is a challenge, and there is always a small number of people who are very vocally opposed to these things, be it low traffic neighbourhoods, be it new forms of shared mobility. But we have shown here at Voi, there is a huge untapped demand. So we've been here in the UK for about 15 months or so, and in that time we've seen 8 million rides and a user base of 500,000 people. And I think that really shows you the astonishing demand there is. And we have half of the market. So perhaps there's another 16 million rides that have been taken on e-scooters since the trial started. And those trials are only in 50 areas across the country. There are many, many more untapped areas, such, for example, large parts of Greater Manchester or Leeds, some of the great cities of England, which don't have e-scooter trials. And to people who speak earlier already, there is an important role that we become a real key part of the transport infrastructure. And if you go to Bristol, for example, which has been astonishingly successful, we have become really part of the transport infrastructure in that city. And we can see ourselves integrating into multimodal journeys. So we really see ourselves working as the market here matures, working with the transit authorities in the Liverpool City region, in Transport West Midlands, in the West of England Combined Authority as well, and with the public transport providers, the bus operating companies and the train operating companies, and in the car clubs to offer that holistic solution, that I suppose smorgasbord of more sustainable modes of transport to encourage people to get out of their single-use cars, perhaps to get rid of those cars, and get in the car club, get on the shared e-scooter, the shared e-bike, or the public transport provider to really get towards that government target of 50% sustainable modes. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Very interesting. Okay, we're going to invite our last panelist up to introduce themselves, and that is Sam Jones, who is Micromobility Director from Serco. Hi, Sam. Welcome to the conference, and it's over to you.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, just quickly introduce myself. I'm Sam Jones, and I run Serco's micro mobility business. For those of you who don't know Serco, so we're a government contractor, effectively, with a global presence. So we operate in UK, Europe, Middle East, ASPAC, and North America. And we provide various different government services, of which transport is one of them. So we're really approaching the shared mobility area from a position of providing mass transport services, such as examples such as Dubai Metro in the past, Caledonian Sleeper. So that's where we sort of come from. In terms of micromobility or bike share, we operate two schemes in the UK. So we designed, built and operated the London Cycle Hire scheme, Santander Cycles, for TfL, and have recently done the same thing for West Midlands as well. Operating a fleet of bikes in the UK of around 14,000, launching e-bikes in the West Midlands today, so a bit of a plug there. And previously ran a mixed fleet as well in Edinburgh. So we're very much coming from the shared mobility angle from a bike share perspective and an e-bike perspective, but fully mirror and support the comments made by Voy and Bolt about the need for a more integrated and holistic solution as we move forward. And I think one of the key observations I have of the UK market is that shared mobility, the acceptance of it is actually really high. So the popularity of shared mobility options and the perception from the public is really good. However, it doesn't always mirror the uptake and usage. And I think that one of the big drivers of that is because often shared mobility is very reliant upon private operators bringing innovations to market, and the way these opportunities are put to market encourages them to often operate in a siloed way. So I think one of a really important discussion point is how they can become more integrated. And like I say, competition is very good, but how can we ensure there's enough opportunity for private operators to thrive in the market as well? So things such as regulation are really a really important consideration. And I think one of the core beliefs we have is that there is a big place for publicly owned shared mobility services, and that there is a big commercial opportunity for authorities to unlock themselves when they consider a long-lasting shared mobility option. A really good example of that, which Voy just touched upon, was the London Cycle Hire. So that's now been around for over 10 years, achieved over 100 million hires, and is widely adopted by Londoners. And I think that enables TfL to obviously realise the full commercial value and also meet objectives such as accessibility as well. So I think that's a really important thread to the conversation that we should discuss, which is how do we ensure that as shared mobility develops, that it can become as adopted as it is accepted, and also how we can ensure that objectives are met around accessibility and integration into the broader transport network, and how do private operators work with local authorities to achieve these things. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam. So we've now introduced all of our panel, and I'm going to invite them all to the stage now, and then we're going to have a bit of a discussion. I've got some questions. Whilst I'm posing some questions to our panel, don't forget that you've got the opportunity to ask questions yourself. So if something that has come up through this discussion that you'd like to put in the Q&A, please post a question there, and we'll come to some of those in a minute. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions, quite broad, which are thinking about what's working well in shared mobility in UK cities and regions. But before we do that, I'm just going to take the opportunity to just sort of set the scene a little bit with some examples that I've experienced. So in my role working across this sector, I've been fortunate to travel around the UK as restrictions have allowed over the last year, and to see some of the really great work that's been going on in our cities and regions. And I've sort of seen great experiences across the UK, but I wanted to highlight something that I've experienced in London, which I think is will kind of highlight some of the things that are working well and some things that aren't working well, just to set the scene. So imagine the situation. You come out of an underground station and you walk down the street and you spot a marked out e-scooter bay. In that bay, you have 3 operators offering shared e-scooters. And next to the bay, you spot a shared electric bike that happens to have been parked next to the e-scooter bay. Pulling up into a parking space is a shared electric car that has decided to park next to the e-scooter bay. What do we have? We have a mobility hub. Now, was this planned by the authority, by the borough? It was not. But these services are gathering together, and that's because they've been allowed to happen. That sounds like a good and rosy picture, and something that we like to see on many of our streets. But if you dig beneath the surface, it's not quite as rosy as it sounds. So, although this was close to an underground station, close to Transport for London cycle hire, and close to bus routes, those e-scooters, the bays weren't dense enough across that area. So whilst you could take a scooter from that point, you have to travel a long way to be able to park it again, which means that it's less useful than it could be. The shared bike was not allowed to park in that location. It was allowed to operate in the borough next door, but it was not allowed to be redeployed in that location. So technically, it was not allowed. The shared car, which was allowed in the borough, is not allowed to park in the adjacent borough, and there should have been 2 operators taking part in that particular contract. One of the operators has departed the UK and not been replaced. So whilst on the surface, this seems like a sort of a micro mobility and shared mobility utopia, there's quite a lot beneath the surface, which means that there are improvements to be done. So just with these sorts of things in mind, I'm going to open up the question to our panel. What's working well in shared mobility in our UK cities and regions? Who'd like to take that one first?
I can go if you want.
Great, Johnny, thanks.
I think that's Sam. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Sam. So I've got a very small screen here. Yeah, let me go for it, Sam.
No, I think very quick answer. So I think there are quite a lot of lessons on this in this particular area as well. But I think what's going well is that there are a lot of innovative enterprises, such as the other parties on this call, who are very willing to enter the market and take some level of sort of commercial risk and you put their R&D into action to bring it to the citizens of the city. So I think that is the number of operators that are now bringing innovation to the market is a really positive thing.
Excellent. So good innovation from the private sector. That's great. Who else would like to come in? What's working well, do we think? And happy to be for you to tell that your things are working well, or things you've spotted in other locations. Johnny, do you want to say?
Yeah, I think. I mean, Bolt has come to this relatively new, right? So I mean, we've been in the UK since 2019, but we've not done shared mobility or micro mobility. And so this year and last year, we had a big focus on speaking to local authorities. I think what is working well is that a lot of local authorities are including shared transport modes in their transport plans. But not only that, we're seeing a lot of tenders which are dropping or about to drop, or we're in the soft engagement phase, which not only have shared transport modes, but it has shared transport modes in one tender. So it's saying we need an operator who not only has a digital platform to allow us to do these things, but they can also offer us e-bikes and car clubs and potentially scooters in the future and EV charging on one tender. Now that tender might be broken up into different bits. If an operator says, look, well, we can do these bits, we can do 3/4 of it, but we can't do all of it. But I think what's really exciting is the fact that local authorities are publishing tenders which acknowledge the fact that you have to do all of this as one to actually get the benefits from it. There is probably zero point in doing a tender for an e-bike contract and a car club contract. And if you have an operator who can do all of those things, now that operator might bid for all of those different tenders, but if you can package it up into one thing and just say, okay, well, this is going to be based around a mobility hub, you know, we recognize that mobility hub might be the best way of doing it, then I think that's a positive. From memory, I think it's Cardiff, which is in a sort of a pre-engagement phase with a tender where, you know, they're talking about these sorts of things where their preference is to basically tender for one operator who can do everything, which I think is really, really exciting. It's not really something that we've seen before.
Thanks, Johnny. Interesting one there about the different sort of procurement, whether you go for choosing individual operators for different services or one. Happy for other people to pitch in on that comment, or indeed what's going well in the UK. Nicola, Matthew, or Alex?
I think if you went to Bristol, for example, and I mentioned that in my opening comments, and saw there how, for example, the e-scooter trial really has been the most astonishing success, because we have the density of parking spots, which is one of the points you made there earlier, Matthew. In order to make these shared mobility schemes work, they need to be within a 2, 3, 4, 5 minute walk. Especially for the bikes or e-scooters, perhaps a bit further for cars, for zip cars or enterprise or whatever. And we've got the density of parking and the number of scooters that you need, so it becomes convenient and reliable, and that's what you really need. Because the thing about having your depreciating box outside your house is, unless it's broken down, and they don't break down the way it did when I was a kid anymore, it's convenient and reliable, and that's what you need shared mobility to become. So I think that's quite an important thing. And of course, we're eliding perhaps into another question, which is what's working so well is when you don't have that density of parking, you don't have the right number of scooters, perhaps for an e-scooter or for e-bikes, for example. So it becomes a less reliable service, and people are just going to and give up and hail a taxi or go back to using their private car. So I think that's quite an important thing. And I think a lot of the problems you raise again, Matthew, would be answered through tendering, and I think cities are learning lessons in that, to make sure that, for example, an operator can't just disappear. You know, we had obviously experience half a decade ago of operators appearing as if they were from outer space and kind of carpet bombing cities and leaving bikes at the end on street corners and stuff. And I know Manchester in particular had an unfortunate experience with all of this. And because we've all seen privatized OFOs and mobikes cycling around still after they withdrew from the market. But in tenders now, they're written into essentially you can't abandon it. There's going to be a comeback on you if that happens. So I think cities are learning the lessons of that. But equally, cities and regional authorities need to give operators the opportunity to make it a success. So the operating areas need to be big enough and need to have the density of parking nodes if they go for mandatory parking, and they need to give you permission to have the right number of vehicles to make it reliable and convenient for users.
Matthew, I think go for it.
Sorry, I just wanted to build off of Matthew's comment. I
Sure.
mean, I think this is as we perhaps transition to things that could improve. I think this question of operational sustainability becomes really important, right? I mean, we have seen trials in the UK with fewer than 100 devices, and plenty of trials with fewer than 1,000 devices. The reality is, while there are certain aspects of the sort of experience of shared mobility that you're able to trial at that scale, you're certainly not able to trial the prospect of if this mode can serve as part of a car replacement strategy, right? Of a car light diet. And so I think that it becomes very important. Talk about the fast, cheap, and good quality triangle of shared mobility really is an operating size, an area, and a fleet that matches policy objectives around social inclusion, pricing, equity. and having operational financial sustainability, right? It's quite difficult to achieve all three of those on their own, and it becomes really important as we start to think about the transition from new mobility to just mobility. It becomes very important to understand the market dynamics that are at play here to ultimately make shared mobility a success.
Alex, I think that's a good point, and I'll come to you in a minute, Nicola. The point about both scale and density. So doing some work with an unnamed authority where we were told that so many hundred e-bikes was a crazy number. I asked the authority how many private cars they had. They said 60,000. I didn't say any more. The other point Matthew make about density of parking and so forth. I was in Cambridge the other day, visiting a friend who lived on the edge of Cambridge. I was able to use the shared bikes and scooters to go from the centre, from the station around and about, and to the very edge, to the last house in Cambridge. And the parking density was such that that was a possible journey. And there are not many cities and towns in the UK where I could say that. And I appreciate Cambridge is probably up there in terms of where you can make these things work, but there's a kind of a standard we want to be aiming towards. Nicola.
Yeah, I suppose we're relatively early in our shared mobility journey, but hoping that we can kind of scale up quickly. The e-scooter trials that we've been running in Greater Manchester, I think, probably have exceeded expectations. I think there was a kind of nervousness in some cases about whether it's the right thing to do. We've now got pretty substantial trials running in Salford, around Salford University, just to the west of the city centre, and now out to Media City as well. So we've got a sort of pretty sizable trial there, as well as in Rochdale Town Centre, which connects Rochdale train station into the town centre, which is completely different sort of set of demographics, completely different topography. So really interesting kind of contrast trial to the Salford scheme. Both trials, particularly the Salford one, have been incredibly popular. We've had, they've both only been kind of fully up and running since March, but we've already had about 200,000 trips by e-scooters. We think, based on initial monitoring, perhaps about a third of those are replacing short car trips or short taxi trips. So there is some replacement of car journeys there. And a number of those are connecting into public transport hubs, so to Metrolink stops, rail stations and so on. So there does seem to be some integration going there. And the average trip length is about 1.8 kilometres. So I suppose a long walk. So I suspect it's replacing some of those longer walks, which, in Manchester weather as well, may help to, encourage people to use public transport and then to, do the last bit of their trip by e-scooter. So I guess that's giving us some encouraging initial evidence on the role that shared mobility can play in the right location. And I guess the approach that we're taking in Greater Manchester, where we can look across the whole conurbation, so we've got a population of 2.8 million, 10 local authority areas that we're covering, we can actually develop a strategy at scale and look at what the opportunities are across what is a very diverse geography, but we can start to develop some consistent policies at that Greater Manchester level. But then also look at a kind of bottom-up approach and understand what local communities need, what different sorts of trips people are making in different parts of the conurbation, how shared mobility might support the regeneration of our town centres, as well as looking at opportunities in and around the city centre. So I'm sort of hoping that kind of high-level strategy, combined with an understanding of what local communities need to help to reduce reliance on cars, and I suppose an adaptive kind of approach, because I think we are going to have to try things out and adapt over time and adjust course as we go. I'm hoping is a sort of sensible strategy, and looking at services at the same time as looking at infrastructure. So we're rolling out a lot of new cycle lanes and lots of walking improvements that will then provide sort of safer infrastructure for some of these shared micromobility services to use. Looking at things like on-street parking and how you can repurpose some of that to provide kind of very local mobility hubs. So we're kind of reasonably optimistic that by taking that kind of comprehensive approach, looking at the right digital services to support that we can start to then see some really quite rapid changes in the uptake in shared mobility and the rollout of those new services across different parts of Greater Manchester.
Thanks very much, Nicola. I'm going to put out two questions now. One because the first question is a bit negative, and therefore I want to counter that with a slightly more positive, opportunistic question. So the slightly more negative question is what's not working well in terms of shared mobility approaches in UK cities and regions. But to kind of counter that and look at sort of potential changes and perhaps think about the good that might come out of this terrible pandemic, which is, I guess, how can we change our approach that might kind of have some positive outcomes of the different ways that we're traveling, given the changes due to the pandemic. So yeah, so I guess the two questions are what could be improved in what we're doing, and then what can we learn and change based on changes because of the pandemic. So happy to take any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think just to pick up on the two previous comments from Matthew and Alex about the density and availability, and I think this sort of feeds into maybe what isn't working so well. So I think, Matthew, I'd said this to you before, but we'd seen an example of a tender for a car club, for example, where it's 10 vehicles in a city of 300,000. So you're offering people 0.0003 of a car. But if in the same tender document, if you're saying, well, we want to measure the impact on private car, on a switch away from private car use, well, it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like you're not going to see that, because people just won't be able to use it. So I think that's kind of my reflection about maybe what isn't working so well. It's great that local authorities want to do this, but I think you do have to be brave, to be bold with the kind of with the number of vehicles. And the thing is, look, if it's not working and you feel that the city is flooded with car club vehicles, take them away. They're not permanent fixtures. The operators are learning as well. I think the big reflections on the scooter, the trials are a little bit disjointed. So I think one of the things that we said before the London trial is that we need to avoid what's happened with bike share, which was that you have some boroughs taking part and some that don't. So you have the situation where you go from Camden to Islington, but then you can't go to Hackney or Tower Hamlets, but you actually want to get to Limehouse or somewhere in South London. So there's a real kind of fragmentation. I think in London it's still very, very zone 1, zone 2 focused, and the parking density I think is just as Matthew said, that's really what will. I think that schemes will struggle if there's not enough parking density, and I don't think that there is in London at the moment. So yeah, I think those would be my issues at the moment.
Thanks very much, Johnny. Thoughts from other people?
I think that there has been what's not going so well is some of the perceptions among some of the city stakeholders for the trials. And I think this is driven, I think, somewhat to the point I made earlier about there is always a very loud minority of people who are unhappy with changes. So that can be from low traffic neighbourhoods or those kinds of traffic calming schemes, or the putting in a cycling infrastructure. So I think we saw yesterday with the INRIX report, as you might, particular lobbies jumping on that, going, look at these cycle lanes have caused all this congestion, which is, well, I think it's like people complaining about the traffic. If you're in the traffic, you can't complain about it because you are part of it. So that would be my answer to that. But then, there is a new mode of transport is difficult. Voi and I'm not here to speak for other operators, but we have all worked extremely hard to mitigate any impacts on other, in particular, pavement users, I suppose. So visually impaired people or people with buggies and with wheelchair users. To really, we have a parking assist, which means you take a picture of how you parked your scooter to ensure that you've left adequate space, generous space for other pedestrians to get past them. And we're not alone. I know our competitors have done something similar. I like to say I think we were the first, but I'm not going to advertise ourselves too much. And so we work with some of these groups in the visually impaired community, in particular RNIB, to co-design racks in order to mitigate any impacts there are. But that hasn't stopped because there are some loud anti-e-scooters or anti-shared mobility voices that we hear, and politicians and therefore officers are sometimes overly influenced by them, I think, and so to lots of the points, perhaps the operating areas are not big enough. And then, of course, any journey you're displacing is going to be higher on walking and cycling than it might have been through car use, because it just isn't big enough, or there aren't enough scooters, or there aren't enough parking hubs to the points that have been made earlier. So I think there has been an issue around that, and some of that sits with the industry. There's no doubt about that. Nothing's perfect, but some of that does sit with the need for people to give these a go and for the bravery, and that is either putting a low traffic neighbourhood, so taking them out after 2 weeks, like I live in Lambeth in London. My neighbour, the London Borough of Wandsworth, did exactly that. Strangely enough, the congestion is still terrible there. So clearly it wasn't causing congestion in that area of Tooting in South London. But similarly, people who've decided they want an e-scooter trial or whatever it might be, shared mobility, and then have not allowed expansion or density or whatever. And I think you can point, I mean, there's not just a Voi areas, and I'm sure the other operators have similar issues as well with their local councils and combined authorities.
And to be charitable about it, this is an experience that the US went through, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, and there is hope on the other side, right? That generally speaking, I think after the initial discomfort, let's say, around the integration of a new mode, it sort of passes into a benignness, right? And so I think there are growing pains, and I think we've seen that in a number of the trials. But generally speaking, within a matter of months, there is a general acceptance. Those loud protests typically kind of dissipate, and instead you're able to start to see. To think more strategically about what this means as part of a long-term solution, how it better integrates into public transport. Some of these questions that are harder to answer in the window of a 6-month or a 12-month trial become a little bit clearer when you've got the value of time to kind of be more strategic.
And I'll just say, I've absolutely no doubt that is true. We know that is true. And I suppose it's just allowing the trials, or whatever you're doing, and that can be new mode, low traffic neighbourhood, to bed in and to become more normalised. And I think it's not allowing the time. I think it was the point, or the opportunity to expand and densify.
And I think with any trial, to be able to be, and this is sort of important for any level of government, to be clear and explicit about what was learned in the trial, right, and how to improve and build upon it, right? It builds credibility to be able to say, truly, if a trial is an experiment, right, like there should be a hypothesis, and it should be tested and evaluated, and the next version of it, whether it's permanent or another iteration of the program. I think one of the interesting things about shared mobility design in the last few years that's quite different than you don't build a bridge in one place and see if it works and move it around if it doesn't, right? But we have the advantage because this is such a scalable solution, and a solution that's so affected by consumer behavior. We have a lot of knobs that we can turn and dials that we can adjust in order to really make shared mobility solutions sort of an optimal part of the mix. So that iteration, I think, allows for public stakeholders to be more clear in what they are evaluating against and how they're going to improve it the next time around, or make adjustments in real time.
Thanks very much. Sam or Nicola, any thoughts on what's not working well, or how the pandemic might be a kind of agent for change, if you like?
So I suppose, from the pandemic, the usage rates that we saw, especially in London, were really, really encouraging. So really significant growth on a pedal bike scheme that's already getting, from UK standards, very good ridership. I think we've got to, from a cycling perspective, and I think it does link to other modes of shared transport as well. We've got to understand where we're coming from, which is typically low propensity. We're a nation that's come from we're quite a big automotive industry. Our cities have been designed and have been prioritised car-centric usage. And I think, to Matthew's point, it takes real political bravery to really shift the gear on that. So that's where we're coming from. I think needs to work better is sort of an understanding of the funding. One of the frustrations I have is that shared mobility is, I think, it's sort of in the roundings compared to where other spend lines are coming from central government and transport authorities. But when we see opportunities come to market, we're not seeing the required funding to meet the objectives of the authorities. I think what that will end up being, or what that end up showing, is that you will struggle to have shared mobility for modes that stick. We may get through trials, but if you want long 5, 6, 7 year contracts or 7 year services where your residents can be sure that they're going to have access to the service, it's going to be reliable, it's going to be safe, and it's going to be affordable, then I think the way we're going to market is probably risking that a little bit. It's not to say that commercial models can't work in that sense, but I do think it introduces more risk and risks the sustainability of the operation. I think I would like to see more opportunities come to market, leading on to Johnny's point, which are a sort of an all-encompassing shared mobility service. And that's not to say I don't want competition, but I think you've got to acknowledge what the authority is bidding for. So if it's London, then obviously there's definitely space there for more than one operator. But outside of London, there aren't many tier 1 cities in the UK. And actually, if you want the commercial operators to come and be there for a long time, you've got to give them a reasonable run at it. Otherwise, I think it's reevaluating the budgets and the priorities, and looking at how you invest and realise some of that commercial opportunity yourself as an authority, and then take that surplus, if you get it, and reinvest it back into the transport infrastructure. So I think that's what I'd really like to see, and I think those are some of the lessons that we can learn.
Thanks very much, Sam. And I think I might go to Nicola.
Yeah, I suppose I can see that there's a relatively narrow window of opportunity over the next year or two as hopefully we come out of this pandemic. I think people are reevaluating all areas of their lives, aren't they, in terms of the sorts of activities they do, how they travel to them. I think alongside that, you've got the phasing out of internal combustion engine cars over the next 10 years. So people, as they're making their next decisions about whether to purchase a replacement car, whether they need maybe multiple cars in their household. I can see in Greater Manchester, there's something in the region of 200,000 or 300,000 households that have more than one car, as well as a significant portion that have no car at all. So people will be making those decisions about whether to invest, say, in an electric vehicle. I think we've got a window of opportunity to show that there are credible alternatives out there, whether that's access to an electric car club, which I think would be fantastic if far more communities in Greater Manchester had access to those facilities, as well as hire bikes or whatever it might be, so that when they're making that decision, they know they have a good understanding of what the alternatives might be. And actually, an electric vehicle is a big upfront investment. Although once you've got one, they're pretty cheap to run. So I think there's a risk around that. But if we can influence that investment decision and perhaps show that there's a real alternative to actually putting your money into owning your own car, then I think that's a big opportunity. And off the back of COP26, people are starting to be much more aware of the impact of their own behaviour. And I think we do have an opportunity that we need to seize over the next year or two.
Thanks, Nicola. I think there's an interesting point there, talking about electrification of vehicle fleets. So e-scooters, we're starting with an electric mode. Bikes are powered by humans or we're electric. On the car club side, I think we've seen, the benefits of car clubs have been promoted as cleaner vehicles than the average fleet. We have a real risk here that as private car owners are increasingly buying electric vehicles, that if the car club sector doesn't keep up or isn't able to keep up with the various conditions that are imposed on it, that actually we end up with a fleet that is no cleaner than the original fleet. Just another anecdote, apologies to my chair's indulgence, wanting to take a shared electric vehicle, so a car club vehicle, for a trip to my parents recently, and the economic one, so the one that I was prepared to pay for, involved a 45-minute one-way trip across North London to pick it up. Now, I don't think that's something that many people would do, and that's in North London. So, but the destination I was going to, should I have wanted to go by train and then take a car club to the far-flung Suffolk countryside, had one car club, not petrol, sorry, not electric. So we think that we've done the job. We haven't done the job. We're just starting. So I'm just going to leave that as a comment. I am going to ask one more question on this section. I'm then going to go to a poll, and then I'm going to look at some of the questions from the audience. So my question now is looking at slightly different areas. So we talked a lot about the good things and the bad things. Whenever we're trying to implement something, we're always asked, what evidence is there for this? Why is this a good idea? Now, with some areas, such as implementing bikes, I think that there's generally few arguments in terms of policy benefits. In some of the other areas, there are often questions that are asked about, why should we put cars here? What's the issue of are e-scooters safe? All these kind of things. So I've got a question for Alex. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the importance of data. What is it that we know? What don't we know, and how can data really help this decision-making process?
Yeah, no, I think data becomes really important to this discussion, both as a as a validator, right, as a way of assessing and actually kind of calling out where those contributions are most valuable, and in part to actually help achieve the decarbonization targets that cities are setting. You manage what you measure, and if you don't have a structure in place to actually evaluate and assess, it becomes quite difficult. I think we've seen that most cities sort of follow a trajectory around using mobility data, beginning with sort of what the heck is going on in my city, right? How many devices are we talking about? Where are they going? What are the origin and destination patterns? This is all sort of useful information for context setting. It helps elected officials and city leaders answer questions from the public or the press. Then they move into the potential for data for planning purposes, right? Many of the providers, including those on the calls, provide data that can be aggregated to assess, where are good locations for new cycle paths, for example, or new mobility hub locations based on sort of demand. Data can also be useful for regulation and management purposes, right? Actually assessing whether companies are following rules about parking requirements, about the number of devices that are permitted. And then ultimately data can be quite valuable in creating this physical or this integration to match the physical integration with public transport. You think about the role of availability data about where devices are located and whether they're available for rental, integrating that into various mobility as a service applications for a combined journey. So this is all sort of the standard set of data that exists. However, I think increasingly a number of operators and cities are starting to look beyond just that traditional bundle of data. Traditional, as of 3 years, this is all a very new industry. Moving beyond that traditional set to start to answer some of the questions that are sort of more contextual. I really like the DFT post-ride survey, actually, that operators are implementing, answering questions about perceived safety, mode shift. These are questions that, because there's a personal personal element to it, are not kind of in those aggregated data sets, but still provide, I think, DFT with some rich answers about the role of shared mobility in kind of meeting some of these other types of demands.
Thanks, Alex. Have other people on the panel got comments about data or the importance of data or evidence?
Yeah, sorry, I was gone, Sam.
I think just a quick point. I think the modal shift piece is really important and interesting, because we measure modal shifts, and I think a lot of the surveys will focus on users of the e-scooter or the e-bike or whatever the service is, and they'll sort of do a questionnaire or pull the data that way. Then equally, we'll see stats or surveys showing that e-vehicles are growing, and roads are getting more congested. So it's like, well, what's the right way to measure modal shift? I don't really know the answer, but I know it's important, and it has to be one of the core objectives.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah,
Johnny.
Yeah, I was just gonna build on that. So I think our perspective is quite interesting because obviously we have car clubs, ride hailing, bikes and scooters on the app. So the testing that we've been doing in European cities is if someone requests a trip of less than 5 kilometers and there's a scooter within 300 meters, and we'll put that scooter on the category higher up the app. So we're doing A/B testing to see whether people, how likely are people to swap to that mode of transport. In markets, I think we've tested it in about 6 markets, and the range is huge. I mean, people are, I think it's something like 25 to 100 and something % more likely to swap to that scooter if it's within 300 meters and if the trip's less. Equally, you know, the data is telling us that we know that people will only, if we suggest them a car club, people are only going to walk 500 meters to use the car club. So then we think, well, okay, well, if people are only willing to walk 500 meters to use a car club, but there's a scooter within 300 meters, then can we get them to use the scooter to the car club to then use the car club instead of the private car? So that's what the data is telling us. I think I would just caution on the data though, because I think that data, second only to financial data, is really, really personal. You can tell a lot of things about people, you know, based on their movements and their travel and their habits. So, you know, while it's great we're collecting all this data, we do need to be careful about what we're doing with it. And I think there has been a rush to just collect data and just see where it leads, where with potentially maybe not some of the thinking about what we actually do with that data afterwards. So in the private hire space, we have very, very strict limits about, we have to delete that data after a certain period of time. So we have to collect it for regulations in London, but after a certain period of time, it gets deleted and we can never access it again. You know, and I would want to see sort of rules like that. I think just to come back to a point that we made before and the other comments about competition, and this does feed sort of into the multimodal point of view, is that in the ride-hailing world, so for example in Birmingham or Newcastle or wherever, you know, we know that our studies shows that people would use a scooter if it's 300 meters away. I think with the trials though, we have created monopolies in these cities, and we're indefinitely extending the trials over and over and over again. And I actually think in some of these cities, what would be better is if we had a lot of operators, for example, doing scooters, who all had, so if the total number of scooters allowed is 2,000, but then you had 3 operators doing that, and you can compare. I think that's better for passengers, so we can compare on price, we can compare on innovation. I think at the moment, you know, we have created monopolies in these trials in the UK, and I'm not sure that's the best thing for passengers.
Thanks, Johnny. Some interesting points there. I'm going to see if we can go to a poll now. So I have a question, and the question is, which city or region around the world is excelling at shared transport? And as if by magic, the poll appears. So you should have the ability to answer that question. And so we're going to just check you're all awake, and we're going to see if there's some answers there. I've just been looking through the Q&A from the audience, so I'm going to go to some of those Q&As now. In fact, I might even go to one whilst we're just waiting for that result to come in, because I think it takes a little moment. So I've got one specific question, and this one's for, oh look, here we go. We can watch these coming in the background. So the specific question is to Nicola, and it's, how did TFGM decide to fund the new bike share scheme? Did they see the bikes as part of the public transport offer?
Yeah, that was really important to us in terms of determining what approach we took to cycle share in Greater Manchester. If you've seen the bikes, you'll see they're yellow, and I think that's really kind of symbolic of the fact that we see it as part of that B network that has become, you know, real focus of our approach to a more integrated, sustainable transport system across the conurbation. So we obviously have the yellow Metrolink system, and bike share is kind of the next part of rolling out that kind of B network sort of branding, really. So we definitely see it as part of that public transport network and sustainable transport network. And some of you might know the B network as being associated with walking and cycling improvements, but since the re-election of Andy Burnham in May. He's really kind of set out that broader vision for the B network as being the full sustainable transport system. So I think that's great, and to see shared mobility as part of that, I think, is a really important message to convey. So the branding is going to be a really important part of building people's trust, I think, in that some of those alternative modes, and seeing them as part of that overall sustainable transport offer.
Thanks, Nicola. And I know it's very early days in terms of implementation, so I'll certainly be very keen to maybe in a year's time, and you can report on how you're getting on.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we're starting to see some words sticking out. So I wasn't quite sure how this is going to work, but it seems to be working quite well. So those of us on the panel, I'll be interested to see your thoughts here. We're seeing Paris, Berlin, and we've got both Scandinavia. Well, it's not quite a country, is it? But it's a region. No, it's not even a region. Is it a region? I guess so. I think that's good. Any comments from the panel on anything that's surprising there or not? I can see Solent. That's good. It's got a UK region there. Not UK, not London. That's slightly big there.
I think it's fantastic to see Milton Keynes listed next to Paris.
As a Paris resident and working on a couple of projects here, I think one of the things that will be interesting over the next year is the discussion on the speed governance in Paris. So right now there's a proposal to limit citywide shared mobility scooters to 10 kilometers an hour. Which if you've been over Paris cobblestones, could create sort of some real tanking of demand. And so I think this is a tension that in many old cities that were the role of speed governance and sort of not just parking behavior but riding behavior becomes really important to get right. And I don't know that we've sort of settled on kind of the Goldilocks approach here. But it's definitely, I think, a city to watch over the course of the next year as we try to get it right. Also, a big tender coming up around electric mopeds next year as well. As was mentioned by Sam, the benefit of a multi-year agreement to add some stability to the market and provide kind of clarity. So that both the operators, know what to expect, and also consumers, households can make decisions about whether or not to own a car based on a sense of permanence of these modes.
Thanks, Alex. And the note on shared electric mopeds, very pertinent. I saw that we're seeing our first shared electric moped operator launching in London imminently. So that will become a thing. Those of you who haven't had the opportunity to travel to European cities recently, which is probably most of us, mopeds have become a thing to add to the transport mix. And I'm not going to get into that debate now, but I think that will be another one to touch on in the coming months. So if we can hide the very good poll there, I think that was good. And I'm going to go into a few more questions from the audience. So this one is an interesting one. So this is a question to all the speakers. How can vandalism towards, and the question is bike share, but I'm going to change that to shared micromobility, be tackled? Okay, I'm going to go to, let's go to Sam.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer to this. It does seem to be something that is prevalent in the UK market. We've certainly experienced vandalism on our schemes, but we've also made really good inroads with things such as community engagement, building partnerships with local authorities and the police force, and where there's obviously clear cases of vandalism. Following through on those processes, and then equally as important is the education piece as well, and understanding what's driving the vandalism and whether it's coming from deprived areas and if it links to a broader accessibility issue. So I think all of those factors need to be taken into account. I think practically speaking, it should be, in my opinion, one of the key agenda items if you're an operator and you're providing a service into the local authority, and you've got your regular review boards, it should be one of the primary agenda items, and it should be being sort of tailed on a regular basis. The authority should be supporting in every way they can to progress from things like I say, prosecutions or investigations. But then equally, the operator needs to continue to innovate and develop their product to build in resistance, which is also a very important factor.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts or comments on vandalism?
I mean, I was just going to say from experience, I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and speaking to people there, they'd had big problems with vandalism. I actually think that the more sophisticated vehicles look, and the better they look, and the more bells and whistles they have, and those sorts of things, almost the less they will be vandalized, because people see them as a real expensive vehicle that they might get into a lot of trouble at if they vandalize. If you have things which are like the fairly primitive e-bikes that we used to have, when they first came to market, they looked and felt disposable, and so I think people thought, wow, if this goes missing, it doesn't matter. Whereas I think now, the move towards really sophisticated vehicles, they look as though they are part of the street infrastructure, and actually, I will get into huge amounts of trouble if I toss one of these in a river. Be interested to get Matthew's perspective on that.
Yeah, I think really just a danger of all singing from the same hymn sheet here. I was agreeing with Sam, actually. It's a kind of Tesco thing of every little helps on managing this. So I think there are product answers. So operators such as Voy and Bolton and everybody else can clearly improve on the product when it comes to how it looks and some of the features and the robustness of them. I think there's also a role for the city and regional authorities and the police are taking it more seriously than perhaps they sometimes do. And I realise clearly the police, are going to say, well, we've got resource constraints and there are clearly more pressing things than a trashed bike. And I understand that. But there is a whole kind of broken windows thing, and this is part of a city infrastructure. And if you smash up a bus, you're going to, they're not going to let that go. And I know bus is different to a bike in its scale, but it is part of the urban realm, and it should be looked after. And I think there's also the fact that as these things have become more used and more used to, and it goes back to all the points about there's a hump which you have to get through, which is not easy, that you will, the prevalence will drop. So certainly when it comes to the Boris bike scheme, and Sam will probably give more data. I'm sure at the beginning when that was launched, I must say I don't remember now, about how many got trashed and stolen and thrown in the Thames or a canal or whatever. But I think I'm going to take outrageously abuse as a point just to come back, I think, on something that Johnny said around multi-operators in areas, because I think that there is an issue here to do with if you're going to have operators operating without subsidy, which is obviously the best thing to do probably when it comes to public purse, they do need some kind of certainty, and that's where properly put together tenders that give you X years operational lifetime in that city with proper KPIs and the rest of it will give operators the incentives to invest properly in those areas with proper robust equipment and infrastructure and racks and all these other things. Whereas there is a danger, certainly in some of the smaller cities, that if you put multi-operators in, you're not going to get enough revenue if you've got three of you squabbling over a smallish town, that you'll get the relatively secure revenues to make sure they will invest properly. So there is a balance here. And I see Johnny's point, of course I do. I believe in competition, but that is where the tendering process can come in for a few years to give Voy or Bolt or Lime or whoever else wins the tender the opportunity to really invest in City X, where perhaps isn't the biggest town in the world.
I think that's quite interesting. Certainly in the earlier days of car clubs, the general view was it's better to start with a single operator, get the thing established, get people understanding what it is, but then to open it up to competition as and when. So I do appreciate it. It depends on the size of the market. Before I move on to that, because I've got a question about smaller cities, Nicola, is there anything you want to say from your experience of previous bike share and vandalism and what you might have been plans for the future scheme or current scheme?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all the comments that have been made in terms of the quality of the product, how solid some of these devices are, people's sort of willingness to respect them, and I guess getting off on the right foot. We did have a bad experience with Mobike that I think has not helped us to. Has probably set us back, to be honest, for a year or so, and trying to get our new barrel bike scheme up and running. But we've put and I suppose as a result of that, we've put an awful lot of time and effort into investing in the right infrastructure, really thinking very carefully about the design of the bikes, working very closely with the police. I mean, time will tell, but so far that we don't seem to be seeing any of the scale of issues we saw with Mobike, and certainly with the Lime scooter trial in Salford. Again, there was nervousness about them ending up in the canal or whatever, but we did have a few thefts early on, and they were clamped down on very quickly by the police, and people realised that they had GPS trackers in, and a police officer was very likely to come and knock on your door if you had one there sitting in your way or whatever. So people soon learned that you weren't going to get away with that, and I think that's really helped to then stamp down on any vandalism or theft very very early on in the scheme, and we haven't really seen that much of an issue with it ever since.
Thanks, Nicola. Sam, did you have something you want to say?
Yeah. Just a final point on that. I think the competition element, which is obviously really important, it can also be a risk to this element, because if you're opening the door to multi-operators, that can really push quality down, because OPEX becomes a real issue then, and that's where you do see the old type of dockless example that we used to see, where the quality was poor, very easily vandalized, which isn't good for anybody. And I think just a final part on the commercial models, and I think it really does come down to a local authority's decision. But if no public money goes into the service, then ultimately there's very little control, even if there is a contract. If a contract's a concession, it's a weaker contract, and it doesn't hold as much weight when funding's going in. And what that can ultimately realise will then be things such as it'll have to be run as a commercial model. So some e-scooter operations can be up to £4 for 20 minutes. If you price that across a year, that's substantially more than any regional travel card. I would assert, but I don't know, even a lower rate of tariff, I think I'd question how sustainable that can be over the long term from a revenue perspective. And I think that's why subsidies shouldn't always be a dirty word and shouldn't be seen as a negative. If an authority is procuring assets, they can depreciate those assets over a much longer period, and they can pick which operators they want. And like I said, the competition element comes at the tender, and that's where you open up the market for your best prices, and then you're holding the operator to deliver to them.
Thanks,
I said that we run both models.
Thanks, Sam. I've got a question now from the audience regarding initiatives in smaller cities, and they've qualified that as cities sort of under 200,000 population. So have got any thoughts or comments of people who have either tried to operate in those areas, are operating in those areas, or how might we succeed in offering shared mobility in smaller cities?
So, Matthew, you said you visited Cambridge recently. That's a fairly small city, and as I mean, there's a great plug for us. Thank you very much. But it is operating very well there. So it shows you that it can work. I think it shows you if you have the proper infrastructure and culture, it can really drive forward micromobility. And in some of the other small cities that Voi is operating in the UK, it really is quite successful. So if you look at Northampton's a bit bigger than 200,000, I think, actually, but it's working very well, but then can work as an anchor, because then you've got the sort of fixed costs are covered in large part to operate some of the smaller schemes you have in the county of Northamptonshire, so Kettering or Wellingborough or whatever. So it shows you that there is a commercial model that can work. And to Sam's point, I have to say, I used to work in public in London's regional authority, so of course subsidy is not a dirty word, but I suppose if you can deliver a decent public service but without public subsidy, you can get the double win. And there are commercial models that work, and it can work in smaller town cities, but you may need a large anchor where you can operate your warehouse and those fixed costs are covered. But I think we've certainly seen Northamptonshire that it can work.
I think the other element to the subsidy question could potentially be in the types of trips that are sort of requiring the subsidy, right? Especially for those areas where you're looking for trips that are really trying to serve a decarbonization purpose, right? For example, those trips above, say 2 kilometers or 2.5 kilometers, where it's much more likely that that's replacing a vehicle trip rather than a walking or public transport trip. In the U.S., it's not uncommon for operators to sort of receive a subsidy from the city for those trips that are serving sort of low income areas as well, that otherwise sort of would not be market desirable trips. And so I think it's quite important to think about the way in which data can actually unlock precision in the way that subsidies are applied to these schemes.
Thanks, Alex. We're coming towards the end of our time now. So I think I'm going to take one last question from the audience on a slightly different topic. This is the topic of mobility hubs. I think we've got a session later today on mobility hubs. So the question is, do the panel see, and it's specifically at operators, but we'll see, do operators see mobility hubs as plug-in infrastructure by others, or is it something they want to be involved in delivering? So I guess we've got 3 operators here. And then I might turn to Nicola just to sum up, as I know that you've been involved in some of that work. So let's go to Johnny, mobility hubs.
Yeah, I think it will always be a public-private partnership with the mobility hubs. I think in some of the tenders that we're seeing, we're creating this mobility hub. Is there a part of it that you could do? Mm-hmm. And I think, to be honest, I think at the moment, all of the mobility hubs will need to be based around rapid charging for EVs. And that's just the reality of where we are, I think, at the moment. So I'm not sure that operators like Bolt would necessarily come in and deploy an entire mobility hub. I think the tenders would need to be broken down into individual bits. But it's something that we're giving thought to. I mean, we're doing quite a lot of work with obviously for us ride-hailing wise, there are something like 300,000 licensed taxis and private hire vehicles in the UK, but they do significantly more mileage than everyone else. Those vehicles do huge amounts of mileage, and so we've done a project in West London to install EV chargers where drivers actually live. I could see us moving into a situation where we're doing more of a mobility hub type thing, but I'm just not sure that we're there yet.
Okay, I'm going to throw it to Sam.
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, I think mobility hubs are sort of exactly the right way in which we should be going. It's creating options, isn't it? And what we need, and I think Nicola said this earlier, is we need real alternatives to using cars. And I think a well-structured mobility hub network would achieve that, where the design is based upon the composition of the local residents, where access to a mobility hub and the services is a short distance away, and where they're well managed and maintained. And I think that is a real alternative to private car use, which is brilliant. I think the thing that needs to progress is, in practice, how does the local authorities want to take these to market? To Johnny's point, the way the structure at the moment, there's a bit of design, there's the shared mobility aspect, there's the maintenance aspect, there's probably a bit of retail as well. So they certainly seem that they'd be well suited to a consortium. It could be a consortium, it could be a prime. I obviously say that because Serco are a services operator, so that's the sort of thing that we do. But that's just one way it could be done. There's certainly others. But I think the key thing that needs to be bottomed out is how do they want to be brought to market? There's a clear conflict here that, like outside of a major city, if you're wanting to locate car share, bike share, e-scooters, e-bikes, and you're going to have them bid in lots, then it's sort of a race to the bottom for everyone. And that doesn't feel very sustainable. So I think that element needs to be worked out. How do you want to be managed? You don't want services competing too much for revenue where everyone loses. So because you're sending everyone to the same place and basically they're just carving up. So, and that I think wouldn't be good. So that is the complexity that needs to be worked through. But I'm sure there's a way to do that. And like I say, it could be exclusivity, it could be a different commercial model. But yeah, once that's worked through, I think that'd be great initiatives.
Thanks very much, Sam. We've got literally 1 minute, so do either Matthew, Alex, or Nicola have a couple of words they want to say just on anything?
I suppose we're excited about the potential for mobility hubs to help attract the right kind of shared solutions in the right locations, and we're trying to develop a sort of comprehensive approach to that. And I think that you'll see a whole range of different scales of mobility hubs, through to very small scale kind of on street stuff in local communities, to potentially some quite big facilities perhaps in new residential developments in town centres, and then somewhere in between, like the sorts of things we're looking to kind of replace the traditional park and ride model at particularly at our tram stops and rail stations. So I think there's a whole range of opportunities, and I think it will require real public and private sector working to identify the right sorts of locations, to understand local markets, and to share our kind of knowledge of those local areas, and what the opportunity might be. So yeah, I'm pretty positive about the potential for mobility hubs, and again, so watch this space to see how they roll out in Greater Manchester.
I'm going to have to end now because I've been given very strict orders to finish on time. So thank you very much to all of our panel for your great discussion. The next session looking ahead today is at 10:45, which is to the suburbs and beyond, the role of shared transport away from the urban core. So it follows on nicely from this. Thank you very much to everybody. It's been a very interesting discussion, and look forward to hearing more later today. Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.